Good morning, everybody. We're here for another constitutional talk, and today I'd like to talk about um, our first shots fired in the conflict, which brings us to April 18 to 19, 1775. This is a rude map. It's not perfect. It's not even to scale. I drew it, painted it, and it's what I'm using today to help describe what happened. Now, Paul Revere, he was a member of the Sons of Liberty, and so was William Dawes, our two main writers. Um, Paul Revere was a member of the North Church, which is famous for putting the lanterns in its steeple to warn that the British were coming. One if by land, two if by sea. This is the North Church. This is your Boston neck. This is your city of Boston at the time. Okay. Now, when those lanterns were lit, it was a signal to Dawes that he should begin his ride. He proceeded out of Boston, heading toward Roxbury. And he got past some soldiers that were on sentry duty, and he proceeded through Roxbury and to Brooklyn. And his plan was to cross the Cambridge Bridge, go over through Monotony in Lexington, and get over to Concord, where some of the ammunition stores were at. The British were trying to get Samuel Adams and John Hancock and capture them. They had an order from the court to arrest them and to confiscate the weapon stores. So Dawes proceeded south out of the city. Unknowing to him, they had also asked Paul Revere to head out. So Paul Revere took a boat across the channel, worked his way over to Charleston. And in Charleston, he got a horse, and he was meant to head straight over here to Monotony. But he was being chased by the British. And as he was being chased, he altered his route and went up through Mystic and worked his way down over to Monotony. Okay, now at Monotony, at the tavern, was Eldridge Gary, or Jerry. He's famous for gerrymandering as governor of Massachusetts later. But he was in charge of maintaining the weapon stores at the time. The weapon stores were out in Concord originally, but the British weren't aware that they'd already been dispersed. So, by the time the Dawes got over to Lexington, and Revere got over to Lexington a little bit first. And at that time, that's when the men from Boston, the Redcoats, took to sea and started their march. So they were marching off that way. So at the tavern in Monotony, they warned Gary about it, and Gary was meeting with a couple of colonels at the time, and that's why he was staying in the Monotony Tavern. By the time the British got there and they searched Monotony Tavern, they were nowhere to be found because they had hidden in the cornfield behind the tavern. Okay, so they proceeded into Lexington and got a little bit past Lexington here. And at Lexington, that's where Samuel Adams and John Hancock were staying. And immediately, once notifying them, Samuel Adams left right away, as he should do. He's got a pending crisis coming on. So they proceeded on, and this is where they met Prescott. Now, Samuel Prescott was a doctor, and it's 1 o'clock in the morning. And he's wandering around out there, riding the road back to Concord. Now, there's some possible reasons that he was out there. Myth has it that he was visiting a clocksmith who had a daughter that he was romantically involved with. He was, trying to court her. I don't know if that's true. We'll never know why he was really out there. He could have just as easily been um, taking care of some sick patient of his, helping a woman give birth. We have no idea why he was out there, but he ran into them, or more than anything, Prescott and Revere, who were now together, ran into him, and Revere already knew him. He was what he described as a friend of liberty. So the three went together from this point on, and they got down to about here on the road, and they ran into some British patrols, and they were stopped. And immediately they tried to run different directions to get away. And they captured Paul Revere, and they questioned him, and they wound up releasing him. They chased after Dawes. He ran into a courtyard, and he called out in the courtyard to the Continentals to get them. They're coming. The Redcoats are coming. And the Redcoats thinking that they were going into a trap, they stopped chasing him. But he got thrown off his horse, and so he's now on foot. And he works his way back to Lexington on foot. Paul Revere is also working his way back after he was arrested and questioned. Okay, but Samuel Prescott, he jumps over a stone wall and works his way over to a tavern and notifying others. Now, as we proceed with this walk, this ride, they're stopping at farms, and they're stopping at businesses, and they're getting people up, and they're warning them that the British are coming. They aren't yelling the British are coming like in Longworth's famous poem, but they are knocking on wood siding. They're getting people up, and so more and more people are coming into. In fact, before they got to where the soldiers had stopped them, they'd already encountered and stopped a bunch of other riders, because they were, all of a sudden, you had all these people coming and warning of the British were coming, and so they had stopped him. Now, Revere works his way back to Lexington, and he comes across John Hancock again, who's still just sitting there, and he's like, "What are you doing here?" And he told him, "Well, I'm going to wait. I'm going to fend off the British." And he said, "Well, you don't even have a musket. What are you doing? You got to get out of here. They're looking for you, and you're a big prize to the British. And on top of that, we need you more than you being a British prisoner. We need you to help lead us in our cause." So, I mean, they were staying out there in Lexington because they were doing business and government business in Concord over here. And so the next nearest town was Lexington, which is why they were staying out there. Well, the British, they worked their way across, and as I mentioned, searching the Monotony Tavern, and we're working their way across to Lexington. Well, by now, it's getting fairly early in the morning. You've got people getting out. The Minutemen are coming onto the Lexington Green, and they're waiting the troops, and that's where they confronted the troops, and that's when the shot was fired, heard around the world, that started the conflict. Once those initial shots were fired, they followed them to Concord, and there were skirmishes kind of along the way in that, and they searching in Concord then for their weapon stores. Now, by the time they get to Concord, Prescott has gone all the way across. He's crossed the bridge, and he's pretty well gone. And he's going further, just warning people of what's happening. And that's the last we hear of Samuel Prescott, too. We have no idea what happened to him. There is a report that he may have died in prison up in Canada, but we don't really know. We don't know if that's the right Samuel Prescott. And so we just don't know what happened to him. We don't really know what he was doing before, and we don't really know what he was doing after. This was his ride. This was his night to shine, because we don't know what happened to him beyond that. And so you get out there. The Minutemen are chasing the Redcoats down, and they're shooting them as best they can, shooting and running. And once they've searched Concord, and they head down to the South Bridge, and then they work their way across the North Bridge to a farm out there. And that's when they decide that they're going to come back, that they're going to do their march back to Boston. The problem the Redcoats have is they control Boston and the Boston area right here, but they don't control the countryside. The countryside is controlled by the radical colonists. So as they begin their march back, they're continually fired on and shot all the way back, and it's a great defeat for the British. We've lost quite a few too, but they've lost more. What's more, they didn't get Samuel Adams. They didn't get John Hancock, which was their purpose for going out there. They didn't seize the weapons stores. They didn't even catch a Jerry. So here we are. They're coming back into Boston, so shot up, it's unbelievable. They're shocked at what happened. You got to remember, at the time, Boston was barricaded off by ships. They had troops stationed in Boston all over that had come down from Nova Scotia, from a fort they had up there. So that's what was going on in Boston. So here's your ride. And the only ones that really get the big credit are Dawes and Revere, especially Revere. It's not just because of the poem. It's credited because of the poem. But the poem is written because he was the main rider. He was stopping, he was knocking on doors, he was doing all these things. And Revere was on his 18th ride with the Committee of Safety at this point. He was a steady rider. He was doing business. This was one of the ways that they were getting information back and forth. Even when the Continental Congress was in session, they were using him to run back and forth. That's what Dawes and Revere were. They were riders for communication. It was like they were sending out riders so they could get information back about what was going on. Okay? Getting back into Paul Revere in his career as a silversmith, he had quite an amount of business doing etchings on silver for the Sons of Liberty members. They had, for instance, he would do an etching of the Boston Massacre, where the Redcoats are lined up against the colonists, not against a wall, which is what really happened. And they were politically slanted etchings, and he made quite a business at this. I mean, he was a businessman at the time, and he was a very good silversmith. So he was selling things like this. He was always also writing articles. He was active in the Sons of Liberty. He was directly involved with the planning of the Boston Tea Party. So these weren't unknown individuals at the time of the ride. They were well-known Sons of Liberty trustees. Okay, because the leadership of the Sons of Liberty entrusted them to do a specific job. And they did a lot of writing. Now, they had a little different backgrounds, but they were all important to us because they were part of the situation of notification back and forth. So it was kind of like an early Pony Express, sort of. They'd send them out with information, and then they get information back. In fact, during the Constitutional Convention, they had to get messages back to Delaware because one of the Delaware was split over whether they would approve the Constitution or not. And they had 3 delegates, but they only had, as I've mentioned so many times, they only had one shared vote. So it was deadlocked, so they couldn't vote. So they sent for their 3rd delegate, who was serving in the military, and then, hey, you got to get back here. We can't vote without you here because you've got to break the tie. So these are the kind of things that the writers were doing. They were going out, getting information, bringing information back. During the war, that's how they were finding out what was going on the front. The writers would come in and out talking to Washington and other commanders in the field, and they were getting their information back. Now, these weren't random people that happened to be busy on one night. They were an intricate part of the military intelligence that was going on. And that's why the redcoats were trying to stop them. That's why they arrested Paul Revere. They didn't question him. They let him go, ultimately. But that's why they were stopping these people. And by the time they got out, by the time many of these riders, not just Revere, Dawes, and Prescott had gotten to that point, they had already stopped quite a few other riders. Because it was just part of the system of communication of the day. This started this night, and the battle of the next day that ensued started the conflict, started our Revolutionary War. Now, remember, there were lots of other incidences that happened earlier. And Boston was a center, it was a hotbed for rebels and insurrection kind of things going on. They were integrally involved in fighting the British. They weren't putting up with having to house the British there. They were mad at them. There was a big degree of, we aren't going to put up with this. And even once they blockaded the harbor, and the rest of the colonists were sending in goods to help them. And there were, like the House of Hancock, for instance, that John Hancock ran north of there, was sending in arms and ammunition down there for the conflict, and intricately involved in the overall fight for independence. So just so you get a feeling and an idea of what really was going on out there that night. Was Samuel Prescott, was he visiting the clockmaker's daughter? Well, what difference does it really make? And if that's part of folklore and people enjoy that, well, that's fine to believe that. Who knows? Revere was important because he was stopping and notifying people along the way. He was getting more riders involved in it. They were warning of the impending crisis. They got a late start, 10:30, I think I read, when they left the city. Dawes snuck by centuries in the city, riding slow until he got out. And these 2 guys had a job to do, and they were bent on doing it. Unfortunately, neither one of them were able to finish the ride. So the chance meeting of Samuel Prescott, a high Sons of Liberty, high supporter of liberty. Something along those lines is what Revere mentioned. He did write several accounts of the ride. A couple of them almost right away, because Congress wants to know what had happened. And I'm not sure exactly, it was 10, 15 years later, he wrote another version of what happened, pretty much all along the same lines of what took place. As he was chased north into Mystic by soldiers, he was pursued. But they all wound up back together in Menominee, heading west. Each one of these kind of stories that we talk about are all important to our founding and what exactly we were dealing with, the absolute tyranny from the British and how they were treating us, all leads us into the decision to declare independence and self-govern. And that's what we're talking about here as part of our constitutional talks. We're discussing why things happen and why and the reasons for many of the things in the Constitution itself come from the experiences that happened earlier on that led us to this fight. Well, I hope you get a better understanding today, and we'll talk to you again on the next talk, Constitution Talk. Have a good week, guys. Bye.